The conflict surrounding Blake Lively didn't begin in headlines. It began on set, inside a tightly scheduled production where authority, accountability, and control collided. As It Ends With Us moved into active filming under Wayfarer Studios and Sony Pictures, internal decisions involving staffing, scheduling, and chain of command quietly escalated into something far larger. At the center of the dispute is the removal of a first assistant director, a role responsible for call times, set safety, and keeping the entire production on track. Once that decision was made, questions followed, not only about who requested the firing, but about why, how, and what the documentation later revealed through court filings, depositions, and PGA testimony. As production delays mounted, missed call times, budget overruns, and competing timelines began to surface. Internal emails, text messages, and formal complaints painted a picture of mounting pressure, one where creative control and producer authority intersected with operational breakdowns. When those records became part of the public record, the narrative shifted from personality conflict to process failure. This video examines what the legal record, production structure, and formal testimony actually show, separating documentation from public narrative, and tracing how a set-level decision evolved into a broader credibility issue. On a professional film set, authority is structured, not improvised. Every department operates within a defined chain of command designed to protect safety, efficiency, and accountability. At the center of that structure sits the first assistant director, first AD, a role that coordinates call times, manages the AD team, enforces the production schedule, and acts as the operational bridge between the director, producer, and the film crew. The first AD does not answer to one personality. They answer to the production itself. Their responsibility is to keep departments aligned, from hair and makeup to wardrobe, from the DP, director of photography, to department heads, so that filming days run safely and predictably. When problems arise, the AD's job is to document them, escalate them through proper channels, and adjust logistics without compromising safety or budget. This structure exists because film sets are high-risk environments. Missed call times, rushed resets, or unclear authority can lead to injuries, lost footage, and costly production delays. That's why the AD team operates independently from creative preferences. They enforce time, not taste. They manage logistics, not image. Producers, including those with producer authority, oversee budgets and creative direction, but they typically do not override the first AD on operational matters unless there is documented cause. When a producer exerts influence over staffing decisions, especially involving the AD team, it is expected to be supported by formal process, not impulse. On large productions involving studios like Sony Pictures and companies such as Wayfarer Studios, these rules matter even more. Studios require clear documentation for any staffing change, particularly when it involves termination. That documentation protects everyone, the crew, the production, and the studio itself. When an assistant director is removed, the ripple effects are immediate. Call sheets change. Departments lose coordination. Scheduling pressure increases. And accountability becomes blurred. That's why such decisions are typically rare and heavily reviewed. Understanding this framework is essential before examining what went wrong. Without knowing how a set is designed to function, it's impossible to evaluate claims of misrepresentation, control issues, or production dysfunction. The question is not whether conflict occurred. Conflict happens on nearly every production. The question is whether established systems were followed when pressure mounted. This context explains why the removal of a first AD is not a minor personnel change. It's a structural disruption, one that sets the stage for everything that follows. The situation escalated when Julie Bloom, the first assistant director, was removed from the production. In a system built on documentation and procedure, the firing of a first AD is not routine. It requires justification, review, and clear records, especially on a studio-backed project involving Sony Pictures and Wayfarer Studios. According to testimony and accounts referenced in the legal record, the termination did not originate from the AD team or from a documented safety violation. Instead, the decision was tied to escalating tensions around scheduling, lateness, and control over day-to-day operations. As pressure mounted, the first AD became the focal point not because the role failed but because it enforced structure. The record indicates that Blake Lively, acting in her capacity as a producer, raised concerns that ultimately led to the removal. Those concerns centered on tone, communication, and alleged disruption rather than formal performance failures. What matters here is not whether disagreements existed. Disagreements are common, but how authority was exercised once conflict appeared. After the termination, a replacement AD was brought in, reportedly aligned with preferences already established by production leadership. This shift altered the balance of authority on set. The AD role, which is meant to operate independently, now appeared more closely tied to producer direction. That change carries consequences. When operational oversight becomes personalized, accountability becomes harder to track. The fallout was immediate. Departments adjusted to new call sheets. Schedules were rewritten. Crew members were left navigating uncertainty about who held final authority. This disruption compounded existing strain and contributed to further production delays. Crucially, the firing also triggered a trail of emails, text messages, and formal complaints. These documents later became relevant during depositions and PGA testimony, where questions focused not only on the decision itself, but on whether established protocols had been followed. The distinction between preference and cause became central. What emerges from the record is a familiar pattern in production disputes. When structure clashes with influence, structure often loses. The first AD's role is to enforce time and safety, even when that enforcement creates friction. Removing that role without clear, documented cause reframes the conflict, shifting responsibility away from systemic pressure and onto an individual. This moment marked a turning point. From here, operational problems intensified, scrutiny increased, and the dispute moved from internal disagreement to formal examination. The firing didn't resolve tension, it redistributed it. Once the first assistant director was removed, the production entered a phase where existing pressure points became harder to contain. Scheduling, which had already been tight, grew increasingly unstable. Call times, location changes, and travel commitments began colliding in ways that exposed how fragile the timeline had become. According to accounts referenced in court filings and internal communications, repeated lateness became a recurring issue. Missed or delayed call times don't just affect one department, they cascade across the entire set. Crews wait, lighting setups stall, locations incur extra costs. When a production loses even a single hour, the impact compounds quickly, often resulting in budget overruns or lost shooting days. In this case, the schedule strain was intensified by competing commitments. Travel between locations, including a Vegas shoot and a Philadelphia trip, placed additional stress on the production calendar. Each move required coordination across departments, advanced planning, and strict adherence to call sheets. When that discipline broke down, the margin for error disappeared. The absence of a stabilizing AD structure made these issues harder to correct. Normally, the AD team absorbs pressure by adjusting logistics in real time. Without that buffer, scheduling conflicts became personal disputes rather than operational problems. Decisions that should have been procedural were reframed as matters of cooperation or attitude. Documentation from emails and text messages shows growing frustration among crew and department heads. Delays were no longer isolated incidents, they were patterns. A lost production week was discussed internally, not as a hypothetical risk, but as a real consequence of ongoing disruption. Each adjustment required rewriting call sheets, reshuffling departments, and renegotiating availability. These breakdowns also raised safety concerns. Fatigue, rushed setups, and compressed shooting windows increase risk on set. The AD team's role is to prevent that by enforcing realistic pacing. When that enforcement is weakened, the burden shifts to individuals who may lack the authority to slow things down. What makes this phase significant is not that scheduling problems occurred, they happen on nearly every production. It's that the mechanisms designed to resolve them had been altered. Instead of addressing logistics through structure, the production absorbed pressure through improvisation. By the time delays and overruns were fully acknowledged, the issue was no longer about punctuality. It was about whether the production had undermined its own ability to function predictably. That question would later resurface as part of broader testimony and formal review, tying day-to-day scheduling failures back to decisions made earlier. As internal strain escalated, the dispute moved out of informal channels and into formal review. This is where court filings, depositions, and PJ testimony become central, not as opinion but as record. Once documentation enters this phase, claims are evaluated against consistency, chronology, and corroboration. The lawsuit and related filings reference a series of emails, text messages, and written complaints that attempt to explain why the first assistant director was removed and how responsibility was assigned afterward. These records don't focus on personality conflicts, they focus on process, who raised concerns, when those concerns were documented, and whether established protocols were followed before termination occurred. One of the key issues examined in testimony is the presence or absence of formal HR complaints prior to the firing. In structured productions, performance concerns are typically documented before staffing changes are made. The legal record reflects disputes over whether such documentation existed at the time or whether justification was assembled retroactively once questions arose. The involvement of the PGA, Producers Guild of America, added another layer of scrutiny. Letters and testimony associated with the PGA focused on whether producer authority was exercised appropriately and whether operational boundaries were respected. This wasn't about creative disagreement. It was about whether production governance had been compromised. Depositions further clarified how accounts diverged. Different parties described the same events through different lenses, some emphasizing urgency and disruption, others pointing to enforcement of scheduling discipline. The inconsistencies didn't necessarily prove intent, but they highlighted how narratives shifted once consequences became clear. Importantly, the unsealed evidence didn't resolve the dispute in one direction. Instead, it exposed gaps between explanation and documentation. Certain claims were supported by contemporaneous messages. Others relied on recollection. In legal review, that distinction matters. Records carry more weight than retrospective justification. This phase reframed the issue. What began as an internal staffing decision was now assessed as a question of misrepresentation, accountability, and whether power had been used to bypass established systems. The legal process doesn't determine who was difficult or agreeable. It examines whether decisions were defensible within the rules that govern production. By anchoring the conflict in documentation, the record narrowed the debate. It shifted focus away from speculation and toward evidence, a move that made the earlier decisions harder to dismiss as routine. From here, attention turns to how operational authority intersected with creative control, and how that overlap intensified conflict rather than resolving it. As operational stress increased, secondary issues began to surface, none more persistent than disputes involving wardrobe, on-set appearance, and creative authority. While these concerns might appear cosmetic on the surface, on a film set they intersect directly with time, continuity, and control. When unresolved, they can slow production and intensify existing friction. According to internal communications referenced in the legal record, repeated wardrobe problems became a point of contention. Costume changes, fit concerns, and disagreements over visual presentation required additional time for adjustments, fittings, and review. Each delay had downstream effects. Lighting setups had to be reset, departments stood by, and shooting windows narrowed. The issue escalated when Sony Pictures reportedly raised concerns about how wardrobe choices were affecting the film's visual coherence. These weren't aesthetic critiques alone, they were operational flags. Costume continuity affects reshoots, coverage, and edit flexibility. When those elements drift, costs rise and schedules tighten. At the same time, disputes over creative control blurred operational boundaries. Producers hold authority over creative direction, but that authority is not meant to override day-to-day logistics. When creative preferences begin dictating scheduling or staffing adjustments, the production structure strains. The first AD's role is to mediate that tension, but with that position removed, there was no neutral buffer to absorb conflict. This environment created space for scapegoating. As delays mounted, responsibility became harder to localize. Instead of addressing systemic breakdowns, missed call times, compressed schedules, and shifting priorities, attention focused on individual departments. Wardrobe, by nature visible, became an easy target. Documentation shows attempts to reframe these issues as matters of professionalism rather than process. Misrepresentation entered the discussion as explanations shifted to align with emerging narratives. What had been logistical challenges were increasingly described as behavioral problems, further complicating accountability. The overlap between creative authority and operational control is where many productions falter. When boundaries blur, decisions that should be procedural become personal. That shift erodes trust, slows resolution, and deepens internal conflict. In this case, wardrobe disputes weren't isolated. They were symptoms of a production struggling to maintain structure under pressure. By this stage, the pattern was clear. Operational issues were no longer being resolved through systems, they were being managed through influence. And once that happens, documentation becomes critical. Every email, text, and adjustment carries weight. Not because it's dramatic, but because it reveals how authority was exercised when the set was under strain. As internal issues became harder to contain, attention shifted away from set operations and toward public narrative. This is the phase where PR strategy, image control, and reputation protection take priority, not to resolve underlying problems, but to manage how those problems are perceived once they surface beyond the production. According to accounts referenced in the record, there were concerns about story leaks and efforts to limit how information reached the public. When productions involving high-profile figures face scrutiny, the instinct is often containment. That can include discouraging coverage, reframing events, or emphasizing alternative explanations that redirect responsibility. These actions don't require coordination to be effective. They rely on influence and timing. The framing that emerged focused on professionalism, temperament, and interpersonal friction, rather than process failure. This shift matters. By centering the narrative on behavior instead of structure, attention moves away from questions about authority, scheduling discipline, and documentation. It becomes easier to explain outcomes without addressing how decisions were made. Reputation management operates through omission as much as assertion. Certain details are emphasized repeatedly, while others fade. Over time, repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity becomes accepted context. In this case, the emphasis on isolated incidents obscured the broader pattern, a production grappling with overlapping authority and weakened operational checks. There were also indications of concern about being labeled difficult to work with, a reputation that can follow individuals and productions long after disputes end. That fear incentivizes preemptive framing. By shaping the narrative early, reputational damage can be softened, even if underlying issues remain unresolved. What's notable is how quickly focus moved from documentation to perception. Emails, texts, and formal testimony exist, but they compete with simpler explanations designed for public consumption. The more complex the operational breakdown, the stronger the incentive to simplify the story. This stage reveals the final pattern. When accountability threatens image, the system adapts. It doesn't deny events outright. It reframes them. Responsibility becomes diffuse. Outcomes are explained without addressing causality, and the record, while available, becomes secondary to the story people remember. By the time attention shifts elsewhere, the production has absorbed the impact. The question is no longer what went wrong, but what lesson was learned. And in environments where image management succeeds, that lesson is often minimal, because the structures that allowed the conflict to escalate remain intact, ready to repeat the cycle. When you look past the headlines, what stands out is the record. Not isolated claims, not simplified narratives, but the accumulation of emails, text messages, depositions, and PGA testimony that show how authority shifted once pressure increased. These documents don't tell a dramatic story. They tell a procedural one. As the production moved forward, attention gradually shifted away from process and toward perception. Questions about scheduling discipline, operational authority, and accountability were replaced by easier explanations that traveled faster. That shift didn't resolve the underlying issues. It redirected focus away from them. What remains is a pattern. When structure weakens, responsibility becomes harder to trace. When responsibility becomes diffuse, image management fills the gap. The public narrative stabilizes, but the documentation doesn't disappear. It waits. This isn't unique to one production or one dispute. It's how high-pressure environments absorb disruption without correcting the systems that caused it. That's why these situations tend to repeat, even after attention fades. If this breakdown helped you understand how these dynamics work, Liking the video helps this analysis reach more viewers. And if you want to follow how stories like this evolve beyond the headlines, subscribe. The most important details usually surface after the narrative feels settled.